Okay, so we are finally here and we are actually creating the head here. First thing first, as you can see that I've actually added the empty hair and yeah, this is basically how we are gonna get started. So let's actually go into the sculpt mode and start adding one hair. Now, obviously the symmetry needs to be on and the interpolate method, all the three check boxes are gonna be, ticked on, but right now you can like see the settings by the way on the point curve were 48 and now we have these modifiers that we can use to set profile to the curves. This is actually super easy to do. If you are making the eyebrow or the eyelid, just use this method. That's why I didn't actually show you the manual way of doing stuff, because you have this modifier in the newer version of Blender and you can actually do it pretty easily. This is what we have, and the idea is pretty simple. We are going to be using the interpolate method. The way it is going to work is pretty simple. It's going to be the workflow is going to be a parent and a child system, just like we used to have in the older hair system. We are going to be creating a whole bunch of parent hairs, and some of the child hairs are just going to follow them. For example, right now, you can see that we have two parent hairs and all the other hairs are just following those. So this is basically what we are going to do for the head, basically for every other hair group. And right now we are actually doing the head. So let's actually just get started. Now, right now you cannot see what I'm trying to do. And because of that, I am actually just going to unhide the sculpt that we've created. And the way that I actually like to approach it is pretty simple. I basically like to add the hairs at the edges, so where the hairs are basically started to grow, you can see the placement of the first parent hair. By the way, this particular guide, you can say, I think calling them guide is actually much better, right, rather than parent. I think guide is gonna be better word to use. So you can see the first guide is actually at the edge of the hairs, like at the edge of the sculpt where the hair is supposed to start. And this is what I'll actually do. You are gonna see. And I am also gonna be using smooth brush a lot. By the way, Blender have not yet given the option to just press shift and do the smooth option, but yeah, you can actually just select the smooth brush instead, and you can see that I am basically following the sculpt right now. So this is basically what I am gonna be doing for the rest of this video. Mostly this is actually the workflow that I came up with, and I think it works pretty nicely, so it is totally fine with me. You can see that I am like lowering down the length because I thought that the length was actually a bit too much, so I had to do that. I am basically just going to repeat this process again and again. I am actually just going to start adding more guides, and then I'll actually just start placing those guides according to the sculpt that I've done, and you can see how it is looking. So yeah, this is basically what I'll be doing. Again, the interpolation guide, the setting is actually going to be at 1, I think, if I can remember it correctly. The reason is for this hair system, you're gonna realize that 1 actually works the best. The transition between the hairs actually becomes less smoother in first interpolation guide. The more you go up, the smoother the transition basically becomes between the guides and the hairs. So that is actually kind of problematic to separate the hairs. Like you can see right now we have the separate hair in the middle, right? The left part of the hairs are going on the left and the right part of the hairs are going on the right, and there is a separation in the middle. And this is something possible only if you use the interpolation guide at 1. If you were to use it at default, it's gonna be pretty hard for you to do that. I mean, you can obviously try and experiment on your own, but I've did, and in the end, I've decided that I'm actually gonna be using the one at interpolation guide settings. So yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. Even though you cannot actually see me changing the setting, which I've already did a little bit ago. Again, you can see that I'm basically doing the same thing. I This is, I think, the second guide that I've added, and now I am actually just trying to follow the mesh that we have sculpted. So one of the thing is the head itself is not perfectly symmetrical, and because of that, you're gonna see that the hairs are actually not going to be perfectly symmetrical. But it is totally fine. You can actually just select the other one that is not mirrored, and just fix that manually. Most of the time it is gonna work. You're gonna see that most of the time it does work. The symmetry does work. You can see that I am basically just doing the same thing, randomly adding the hairs now. Not the hairs, but the guide. And just trying to make sure that each and every single one of these guides basically follow the sculpt as close as possible. You don't really need to be 100% accurate, because the hairs are not going to be 100% accurate in the end, the children hairs. So just make sure that it is like pretty decently placed and everything. But yeah, this is basically the workflow. I am actually just gonna start adding the guides now, and start not changing, but placing the guides at the right place. And you can see how the hairs are basically, like, not the hairs, but the guides are basically growing, like they are not in the right place. And this is just the process. You add the guide and then you place it. You basically massage it to make sure that the volumes are correct, and it basically matches the sculpt. Obviously, if you are a good groomer and you have the idea of your hairs pretty nicely, you don't really need to do a sculpt. In my case, I kind of like to do a sculpt before, but yeah, it is totally up to you. You can see that I'm actually just adding the guides. Obviously, it's not enough. You can clearly see that these amount of guides are not enough. So I am just gonna keep on adding the guides until I feel like that the guides are actually good enough, and they are basically making the hairs controllable. Right now, the hairs are not obviously controllable. Like, the guides are obviously not enough that they can actually control the hairs decent enough. So I am actually just gonna keep on adding the guides like this, so that eventually the hairs would basically follow the guides as I actually want them to follow. Right now you can see how the guides are looking, and they are kind of weird. Just keep on adding the guides. Eventually they're gonna follow. The hairs are gonna follow them. One tip that I actually like to share is, if you feel like that some hairs are going way too out of if they're not following the guide enough, just make sure that you place the guide at the root of that particular hair, and the guide is actually going to be much more closer to that particular hair. I really hope that makes sense, by the way. And that way, if you were to change the guide, those particular hairs basically start to follow. And you're going to see that in the future, by the way. If that didn't make sense, that's because my English is bad. But in the future, you're going to see me doing the same thing. Right now, we don't really need to do that, because the guides are not enough, and I am just adding the guides, like adding the decent amount of guides. The idea is pretty simple right now. The idea is to have decent density of guides, and as you can see, the more guides you add, the more control you're gonna get on your hairs. Sometimes the guides does not follow the brush properly, and you have to exaggerate the strokes a little bit. But after that, if you were to just use the smooth brush, the guides would basically just adjust itself automatically, and you're gonna see that I actually use the smooth brush a lot. In this particular case, I have already sculpted the hairs, so I know the volumes In your case, if your hairs are actually much more simpler, then you might not be like might not have to do the sculpting part. But in this particular case, I kind of had to. Maybe because I'm actually a dumb guy, when it comes to making like grooming hairs. You can see that I'm basically just trying to make sure that there is no empty space where there is no guide presented. So I am actually just adding the guide everywhere. Basically, I don't really want any place to be vacant or empty. So I am just trying to equally populate the head mesh with the guides. Right now, you can see that I'm basically adding the guides only on the edges, like where the hairs are starting. Eventually, I am also gonna go in the middle of the head and start adding the guides there as well. But yeah, right now, this is what I'm doing. I don't think that it is like super complicated, by the way. I am actually just following the mesh, and you can see that I don't really need to be 100% accurate. I just need to make sure that the bigger volumes are correct. That's what I'm actually trying to do. Every time you actually come in the local view or maybe hide the sculpt, you can clearly see where you actually need the guides to control the hairs. And as you can see, I am trying to add the guide in one of these areas, and like you can clearly see that I've actually said it before. If you feel like that some of the hairs are going way too out of if they're not normal, if they're spiking out, just place a guide in those hair roots, and you're gonna be able to control them a bit better. And you can clearly see that happening over here. I have placed the guide specially to control those hairs. Some of those hairs actually have followed the guide, and I just need to add a little bit of guides, more guides to control them a bit better. But as you can see, we have already started doing that. Yeah, you can clearly see that I am basically following the hairs to place the guides to see exactly how the guides are gonna behave. I mean, the hairs are gonna behave with the guides. This is actually just me placing the guides until all the hairs basically start following the guides. Right now, we obviously don't have enough density of the guides, and that's why the hairs are not actually following it. But yes, you can see that some of the hairs does not actually follow the guide, and you can place your guides according to those hairs. And that's what I'm gonna doing for the rest of the video. Wait, not for the rest of the video, but majority of the video. You can actually see that I'm just gonna keep on adding the guides and just gonna keep on grooming those. Okay, so right now we have that much amount of guides as you can see, and this is basically the hairs we are getting. We don't have any guides in the middle, like all the guides are actually at the edge. And as you can see, because we have a bit too much room in between those two guides, I basically have just placed one in between them. So slowly we basically are just going to populate the whole mesh with the guides. And eventually all the hairs are also going to start following them. This is basically what we are going to do. Eventually the hairs actually start following the guides. We're just going to have to keep on adding them. Again, you're gonna see that not all the guides are 100% accurate to the sculpt, but even if they are like 95 to 90% accurate, I think it is still gonna work. But because in the end, the hairs are not gonna follow them 100% accurately, so the volumes actually matters more than the exact placement of the guides. So make sure that the volumes are correct, like the directionality is correct. This is basically what I'm doing, and you can see this is like the first guide I think that I've added in the middle. So this guide is not at the edge, and I have basically just started adding guides in the middle of the head as well. This is again just me trying to populate the head equally in terms of guides, because we already have hairs equally on the head because of that mask that we have created, that we could have also used with the weight paint. But yeah, I mean, I've shown you how to use the weight paint, by the way. So in this course, I actually have used the image method, but just replace the image with the weight paint and you will be fine. I was actually kind of dumb that I didn't realize while I was creating the hairs. Maybe I was actually a bit too focused on the hairs that I didn't realize that I could have just used the weight paint method. As you can see, the amount of guides we have, and I am basically just looking for some empty spaces on the head where I can actually start adding the guides. This is basically what I just did. I figured out an empty space and then I've just added the guide there. Okay, so you can see one thing that the guides that I'm adding in the middle of the head, they are not coming out till the top. I'm not giving them the same volume that I gave to the outer ones. And that's because the hairs in that particular region are gonna be underneath. So in order to simulate that, I also need to make sure that the guides actually don't come out on top. As you can see, the more guides you add, the more control you're gonna have on your hairs. Eventually, you're gonna realize that you are basically done and you don't really need any more guides. This is actually just me creating as much guide as I really need in order for my hairs to get controlled by all the guides. I mean, right now, obviously, the hairs are in control of the guides, but the guides are not enough to basically groom the hairs in detail. Right now, you can see because this particular guide is actually at the outside area. I am just making sure that the volume is similar to the sculpt. Yeah, if this guide would have been in the middle, I would not have given it the similar volumes. This is basically what the idea is right now. Okay, you can see that there are so many empty spaces and I can actually just start adding the guides. This particular guide is not going to have similar volumes. I mean, technically you can give the similar volumes, but this particular guide is going to be the underneath part of the hair. So also make sure that these guides also does not come out of the head as much. As you can see that I'm not really giving them the same volume. Also flattening this particular part out. You can clearly see that now that I'm kind of done with the outside guides, I am basically just going one layer in. You can like see how I am adding the guides. So I am actually trying to add them layer by layer. So right now I am actually at the second layer, and these particular guides are not gonna be at the top, so they are going to be underneath the outermost guides. One thing that I'll actually say is because this is a portrait course, I do encourage you to kind of cheat a little bit. If you cannot see the back of your head in the portrait, just don't bother create that. In my case, I did create the back part. but in the end you're gonna see that in the renders you don't even see that. But I still did that. I could have just ignored that, but it's totally fine. You can if you really want to, and if you don't really want to, just don't do it and save some time. It is totally up to you, totally your own choice. Do as you like. Okay, so as you can see that I've actually added a few guides, and this is basically the result. The hairs are not as messy as they were. We are actually using the one at the interpolation guides. This is the kind of result you basically get. If you were to just use a bigger number, you are actually going to see that the transition between the hairs are actually going to be much more smoother like this. We cannot actually do that, otherwise we are not really going to get the separation between the hairs that we are getting right now. You can see that I'm actually trying out some settings, maybe it would work, but you actually cannot separate out the hairs. You can see that the hairs are actually pretty joined, there is no separation that we want in the middle, right? So in order to get that separation, I actually had to use the interpolation guide at 1. The default is actually at 4, so you can like Experiment on your own. If the 4 is working for you, obviously go for that. In my case, you can see that I'm not actually getting this separation that I'm getting right now. So I had to use this, and now I think I'll actually need to add a little bit of more guides to better control the hairs, and that's what I'm gonna do. As you can see that most of the hairs are already been controlled. Some of the hairs like this, you can see that I'll actually just start adding more guides to get more control. So that's basically what I'm gonna do now. Okay, so as you can see that in order to actually make the transition smooth, I am actually just keep on adding the guides. You can see that some of the transitions in between the hairs are not actually clean enough. So in order to make them clean, I am actually just adding the guide in between those parts. That's basically what I'm doing right now. Maybe if I were to go into the interpolation mode, like if I were to enable the modifier again, I might be able to, we might be able to see it. Right now, I'm actually just grooming the guide. You can see that some of the parts are not, like, for example, this particular area, it could be pushed out a little bit. And that's what I'm doing right now. You're also gonna see, if I were to just smooth this out, you're gonna see wherever I'll actually start adding the guides, the area is gonna get smoother. Maybe, in the future, we're gonna see that, but right now, I'm actually just fixing this particular guide. Again, we have a little bit of chaos going on in back of the hairs, which we are gonna fix in the future. Right now, getting all the details is not what I'm thinking right now. Actually, getting the hairs in the right direction and following the guide is basically what my concern is. And right now, just I am adding the guides to make sure that the hairs actually looks nice. And right now, basically, the bigger volume is what I'm thinking about right now. Right now, I am actually just trying to add a little bit of modifiers to, add a little bit of randomness in the hairs. So as you can see, the first modifier is actually the trim curves. And what it does, it basically randomly trim down the hairs, which means some of the hairs are going to be shorter and some of the hairs are going to be lengthier, which is going to make the hairs look a bit more natural. So this is like the first modifier that I'll actually add. And as you can see that I'm basically just, playing with some of these values, and you can obviously just try it on your own. So right now you can see that I am basically trying to figure out the length factor, and that is something that is actually changing the length pretty significantly. You can actually just try it on your own. Like there is a randomness. For example, right now the mask is at zero point 0.5, which means that it is only affecting half of the hairs. This is something that I actually wanted to do. So you can see that the random offset is at 0.05. That random offset is also giving us more randomization in the length of the hairs. So this is basically what I am trying to do with this modifier. After that, we are actually going to start adding some of the clumps and the noise and stuff. Let's actually see which one I'll add. So you can see that I'm actually adding the clump modifier. Now with the clump modifier, you're gonna see that it does not actually follow the guides. And if I were to just remove the existing guide map, you can see that's how the clump basically looks like. You can actually change the clump size with the guide distance, and you can see with this you can just change the size of the clumps, and that's what's happening right now. In this particular case, it doesn't really need the clumps doesn't really need to be on the guide. I am actually going to show you in the future how you would be able to do that, because in this particular case we didn't really needed the clumps to be on the guides. But yeah, I am actually using the clump, and as you can see that I'm not really using it at 100%. This is basically the settings. You can see how I am actually using those, and you can see the difference that it is making as well. You can see that I'm actually just playing around with the factors and turning it on and off to see how exactly the clumping is looking. This is basically just an trial and error stuff. The settings that I'm gonna use here does not. There is like 99% chance that this particular setting is not gonna work for you. So play around on your own and see if it is actually working for you or not. In this particular case, you can see that I'm actually trying to create a clump in a way that hairs basically looks like that they are in a part of clump. I mean, there is a clumping going on, and there is a little bit of variation because of that. So this is basically what the idea is. This is what I'm doing, and now I am actually changing the setting in the trim hair curves. So just trying to figure out what is actually going to look better and what's not going to look better. Now we can actually start adding, let's see, I think the noise, obviously, because we definitely need a little bit of noise. And in order to work on the noise, I basically have just arranged that into the geometry nodes. So the idea is pretty simple. I want some hairs to have noise and some hairs to don't have noise. And in order to set up that in geometry nodes, you can see that I basically have added the curve info node. I am using the random value node in order to get that. And now if I were to just increase contrast on color ramp, you can see that you basically can change this amount of hairs that basically use the noise. Some of the hairs have noise and some of them don't because of the setup that we have actually just created. As you can clearly see, some of the hairs are pretty noisy and some of the hairs are pretty straight. So this is happening because we've just created this setup. Yeah, you can like see that I'm actually just trying to change the noise settings to make the hairs look a little bit random, and not all the hairs obviously, as you can clearly see, but some of them. So these are some of the flyaway hairs that we call. That's why you can see that I don't really want all the hairs to have this noise, otherwise it is not really gonna look that good. The color, the value of the color is basically going to be the strength of our noise. So as you can see, if I were to increase or decrease the value of the color, the strength also changes. So this is basically what I'm trying to do right now. At this particular point, I am actually trying to also change the contrast of these colors so that the more noise or the less noise basically appears. And as you can see, as I'm increasing the value, the strength is also increasing. So this is basically the same thing that's happening right now. Now, this is actually one of the cool reasons, like one of the most important reasons for using this particle system, sorry, not setting. And that reason is that you can actually just layer so many of these modifiers on top of each other. For example, I'm actually using the clump here again, and I am using the same nodes in this particular setup as well. So the setup that I've created for the noise is basically what I'm using right now. And the idea is again pretty simple. I want some of the hairs to have clump and some of the hairs to don't have clump. And in order to control that, I'm actually using the same setup. So right now you can see that if I were to increase the value, you can see that the hairs basically have started to get some clump. All the hairs basically have the clump because the contrast is not increased on the color ramp. This is basically what I'm doing. I'm actually, clumping the noise, the hairs after the noise. This is actually one of the cooler stuff. Okay, now I basically have duplicated the noise modifier, and as you can see that I basically have changed the shade so that different hairs would actually get affected from both of these modifiers. This is actually just me trying to give as much randomness as I possibly can to make the hairs look much more natural. So we have two noise modifiers right now. The one is I have selected currently, and the one is the bottom one. And yeah, let's actually decrease the viewport amount so that we basically can have slightly faster viewport. And I've told you that this method is actually going to be pretty back and forth thing because you cannot actually just go step by step and remember all the settings. So this is actually just me trying to figure out what is looking right and what is not looking right. And as I'm actually going forward, I'm just like, I'm just figuring out the settings basically as I'm going forward. You cannot actually remember all this stuff because every hair is different. So make sure that you experiment with your own and try to figure out the setting that basically works with your hairstyle. Changing these settings to figure out which strength is basically working or not. So right now this is the noise modifier that I'm actually working on. This is basically how the hairs are looking right now. There isn't really anything for me to commentate. I'm basically just trying to look at the reference that you cannot see. Obviously, the reference is on my second screen. And I am actually just trying to get as close as I possibly can in terms of the randomness. This is how it is looking right now. I am just gonna start changing all these settings, all these small little settings. I'm gonna try to figure out what works and what does not work. As you can see that I'm actually trying to increase the noise because I felt like that the hairs were actually a bit too smooth and I don't really want that. So these are some of the stuff that I'm actually just trying to figure out right now. The way I am actually, again, I'm just gonna say it again, the way I am changing the strength is by changing the value of the color because this is what we are, using right now. We created this setup and yeah, this is basically how I'm changing the strength. this is actually something that always happens. You go back and forth and try to figure out which settings are working and which settings are not working. So you basically just go back and forth to make sure that everything actually works. As you can see that I always go back to the highest, like the at the 100% viewport to see how exactly the hairs are looking after I'm done changing some of the small little settings. Okay, so right now I'm actually just trying to remove some of these modifiers to see what is affecting what. So basically, which modifier is having what kind of effect. And in order to see that, I'm basically just disabling all other modifiers. That is one of the ways to figure out how exactly that particular modifier is affecting the hairs. Right now, in this particular case, I don't think that I've actually used the clump as much. But yeah, some of the same settings also can be seen in the noise modifiers, and you're gonna see me changing that. So surface deform is also one of those modifier that I don't know what it actually does. I mean, at least in this particular case, I have no idea. I know that if your geometry is deforming, it does have its use. But in our case, the geometry is not deforming at all. I don't think that it is actually that important if the geometry is not deforming. So I basically have this disabled, and now you can see that I'm basically just layering the modifiers on top of each other. So again, there is another like clump modifier that I have added, and yeah, you can see that I'm actually just gonna keep on layering these on top of each other to see if they are working or not. So right now you can see how the clump is basically looking. You can see that after the clump didn't really add as much, only just a little bit, but that little bit is only what I actually wanted. And right now you can see that I'm basically just using the trim hair again on top of that to basically trim out those hairs and make a little bit of more randomness in the hairs. If your hairs are actually much more smoother, you might not have to add that much of noise or randomness. Obviously, because in my case, I actually wanted my hairs to look a little bit messy, just a little bit messy. I basically went with this. Okay, so as you can see that how the hairs are looking and how many modifiers we have added. Don't you worry, by the way, if you feel like that you cannot actually understand this. This is not something that I can actually explain you step by step because the amount of settings that I change is a little bit too much for me to explain. And right now you can only think about it like that I'm actually going for a messy kind of a look. That's basically what I'm trying to achieve. Also, you are gonna get this file, so you can just always check it out, check out the modifiers and everything. This is actually what I'm just trying to do. I'm just trying to change all these settings to make sure that it basically looks as natural as it possibly can. All these modifiers, as you can see, are available on the asset browser, so you can pretty easily just drag and drop these modifiers on your own. Like it's not like super complicated play around with these settings. So as you can see that I'm actually still trying to clump some of these hairs, and the modifier that I'm trying to clump is one of the first ones, which means that it is not going to affect the hairs as much, but it's still gonna be good enough that we basically can play around with the settings. Again, I'm actually just changing all these settings, and you can there is no explanation for that. I am basically just looking at the reference and trying to figure out which setting is basically making my model look closer to the reference and which one is basically making it a little bit weirder or bad. So I am just trying to figure out these settings and looking at the references. Okay, so I think I am gonna add a color. So this is only a viewport display color, and yeah, this is basically where the head hair is actually done. And I am gonna see you in the next one. And if you were to feel like that modifier is a bit hectic, actually try it on your own, and you're gonna see that it's not really that complicated. Actually, it's pretty simple to do. And I'm gonna see you in the next one.